Hi, in this e-video, we will be looking at how to answer hybrid questions in source-based case studies. But before we look into this, we need to go and attend to a crime. Well, what happened? Mr. T was found stabbed and murdered last night. He was found lying in a pool of blood. Thanks to CCTV footages, the murderer was seen doing the deed. Unfortunately, the CCTV images were not very clear, and therefore the face of the murderer could not be identified. However, thanks to extensive investigation, the police managed to shortlist 3 suspects, and suspect number 2 looks likely to be the murderer. And as we all know in various drama serials, suspect 2 denies that he was the murderer. In fact, he insists that he was drinking at a nearby coffee shop with friends and was nowhere near the crime scene. Now, as a police officer, what would you do next? That's right. You would want to check on suspect's 2 account and ensure that he has a credible alibi to back up what he said he was doing on the day of the murder. As a result, the police investigates further. Well, they interview Mr. A. Mr. A says, I was with suspect 2 on the night of the murder. We drank beer at the nearby coffee shop until 2 a.m. and then he took a taxi home. There was no way he could have murdered Mr. T. Now, as the police investigating officer, do you think suspect 2 is innocent in this case? Well, it could be, as both A and suspect 2 both say that they were not, suspect 2 was not at the crime scene on the night of the murder. So, what have we actually done? We have actually corroborated Mr. A's account with suspect's 2 account of the event. And you have found that both of them agree that suspect 2 was not at the crime scene on the night of the murder. However, you need to then look at Mr. A himself. Is Mr. A a credible witness? The police goes on to investigate. They interview suspect 2's neighbor, Mr. B. Now, Mr. B says, suspect 2 works as a teacher, and that's a highly stressful job. I know he always winds down with beer on Friday after CCA at the coffee shop. He points to Mr. A's photo and says, yes, I saw Mr. A together with suspect 2 at the coffee shop drinking on the night of the murder. There were at least 10 marks on the table. Now, let's take a pause. If you are the police officer, do you think Mr. A is a credible witness? Well, I would think so. I think I can trust Mr. A's statement even more now because somebody else, Mr. B in this case, is able to back up Mr. A's statement. So, Mr. A's claim that suspect 2 was not at the crime scene but drinking with him was supported by Mr. B. As such, I think Mr. A's statement is very trustworthy and reliable. In this case, suspect 2 now should have a very credible alibi. He is likely to be innocent. But before we can acquit suspect 2 and look elsewhere, we now need to dig deeper about Mr. A. And then we found out that Mr. A is actually suspect 2's very good friend. Number 2, Mr. A owes suspect 2 100,000 in loans. And more importantly, Mr. A and the murder victim were business rivals. Now, do you think Mr. A is still a credible alibi? What could be his motive for covering up for suspect 2? Is A still reliable to prove suspect 2's innocence? Well, when we take a look at the possible motive of Mr. A, he probably provided an alibi to suspect 2 because he needed to help suspect 2 as he owed suspect 2 a lot of money in loans. Another possible reason was because if suspect 2 kills off his victim, Mr. A will have one less business rival. So there is a lot of reason why Mr. A would want to cover up for suspect 2. Now in this case, Mr. A cannot prove that suspect 2 is innocent based on provenance. So gentlemen, what have I done so far? What has this crime scene got to do with hybrid questions? Do you realize that throughout the whole investigation, I'm not interested to know whether suspect 2 is innocent or not. I am more focused on Mr. A. I am interested in finding out whether Mr. A is a credible witness. How can I find out whether Mr. A is a credible witness? I do 3 things. Number 1, I will cross-check Mr. A and suspect 2's account. Are there similarity or difference? Secondly, I will then look at Mr. A himself. Is he a credible person to be a credible alibi? How do I find out? First, I check on A. I find another source to see whether there is somebody else who will say the same thing as him. Lastly, I will check on Mr. A himself as a person, the provenance. Does he have an ulterior motive? And that's exactly what hybrid questions are about. Now, let me share with you some examples of comparison reliability hybrid questions. If you take a look at all these questions, there are 2 sources involved here. But really, what do I need to do? Well, I am actually looking at the quality of source D for the first instance. How far does source D prove that source E is wrong? What I'm really doing, or what the question is really asking, is whether source D is a reliable source enough to prove another source wrong. Similarly, study E and F. Having read E, can I trust F? Which means that after I've read source E, does F says the same thing? If they say the same thing, I possibly can trust F. But what I'm really looking for is the credibility or the reliability of F itself. Because really, if you take a look at this question, if I erase this phrase, having read E, if this is erased, what I'm really asking is, can I trust F? Now, thirdly, study sources A and B. Does what the newspaper say in source A mean that the minister must have been lying in source B? Now, in this case, I'm really not actually looking at whether the minister is lying. I am asking whether I can trust the newspaper in A. Is the newspaper in source A credible source to prove other people are lying? Is source A credible and reliable source to prove another source to be wrong? Look at the fourth one. Study sources E and F. How far does source F disprove the claims made in E about show trials? Now, this question uses a very interesting word, disprove, but you know that the root word is actually prove. All right, so this is actually a reliability question. How far does source F prove or disprove the claims? Means that I am now looking at the reliability of F. Is F a credible source, a reliable source to prove or to disprove the claims about somebody else? Is F a credible source to begin with? And lastly, the 2018 O-level question. How far does source C prove that the confession in B was false? I don't care whether the confession was false or not. I'm interested to know whether source C is credible enough to prove another source to be false. That is what the question is really asking. Does C prove that another source is false? So I will look at source C and judge source C. Is source C a credible source? So, what is the answer structure for a hybrid question? I'm going to use this question as an example. How far does D prove that E is wrong? Now, if you think about it, if D proves that E is wrong, it means that D and E says different things. That will call for D to prove that E is wrong. So how do you answer? For example, you can say that source D proves that E is wrong because the two sources differ over whatever is your OI. Please remember, you are not comparing for the sake of comparing. You are comparing in order to answer the question. So if the sources are different, there is a difference, then does D prove that E is wrong? Yes, it does. All right, since the both of them say different things. However, if both of them say the same thing, then source D does not prove that E is wrong because both of them say the same thing about an OI. So that is your first paragraph. Now, once you're done with the first paragraph, the next thing that you do is you will now focus on source D. Is D a credible or reliable source to prove another source wrong? So step 2, you need to establish the claim of source D. Forget about E, focus on the reliability of source D. So as we do reliability question, the first thing that you need to do is to establish a basis. So first of all, you will now establish the basis or the claim of D. According to source D, give me the claim, provide the evidence and the explanation. After that, you then give me a cross-reference either to another source or to your contextual knowledge. Now, source D is reliable and can prove E wrong because it's supported by X, which also tells me the matching claim. So the two claims must match word for word. Now, take a look at the logic of part A. If another source, in this case source X, says the same thing as D, then D is a reliable source. All right. Alternatively, you can use contextual knowledge. So source D is not reliable and cannot prove E wrong because it is contradicted by contextual knowledge or source Y, up to you, which tells you the matching claim. So once again, you need to make sure that whatever statement that you put here must be a direct opposite of the initial basis that you have established. Now, take a look at step 2. Again, we need to look by logic. Source D is reliable because another source backs it up. Source D is not reliable because it is challenged by source Y, or you can use your contextual knowledge. Now, please do take note that you only need to do either one. There is no need to do both. And as we mentioned for history, a higher mark will be awarded if you use contextual knowledge. This is one very subtle difference between history and social studies. Lastly, the highest level. Now you are going to evaluate the reliability of source D based on CAP. So you say that D is a speech by or is a poster by whose purpose is, and you go on to do the purpose of source D. So as I mentioned to my classes, you can use the acronym VAMEO. And then please answer the question. Go back to address the question. You are evaluating reliability based on CAP in order to ascertain D is not reliable, and as a result, it cannot prove another source to be wrong. So you must answer the question that D is not reliable and cannot prove E wrong. Alright, I hope this helps in answering comparison plus reliability questions.